much does an average Singaporean need to survive in Singapore? What is the minimum income needed for the average Singaporean with different household sizes? According to the study on minimum income standard by our two guests today, amongst other authors, the minimum income needed for a single parent with one child aged 2 to 6 years old would be about $3,369. And of course, there are other numbers depending on household sizes. So good evening, everyone. Welcome to episode 69. And I am absolutely delighted today to have with me on Teh Tarik with Walid two returning champions. Both of them have been on Teh Tarik with Walid before. I am excited to have them back again. So one is my colleague, Professor Teo Yenn, and the other is Dr. Ng Kok Ho, and both of them have devoted a lot of time and effort and energy into the topic that we're going to discuss today, the minimum income standard for Singaporeans. And what exactly does it mean? And how do we understand income? How do we understand how much a person needs? And there's more than just a mechanical element behind this discussion. So I will bring them on. And
so first of all, so excited just to succeed in getting on IG Live.
First of all, thank you for creating Instagram just for this. I am very honored. Okay, so let's get to it, right? So the minimum income standard study, what is it? What exactly were your findings? What was it about? What do you want to achieve out of this? What do you want Singapore and Singaporeans to get out of it?
Okay. Well, first, thanks so much, Walid, for having us on your show. And thanks everybody who's joining now. I see lots of familiar names and it's really nice. Just to sort of back up and just give a little bit of context, we started this work partly because we had each been, members of our team had each been doing some work on poverty and inequality. And in the course of doing that work, lots of people ask us, if poverty and inequality are problems, what is the solution? And we decided that we really need to think about that seriously. And one big piece of the puzzle is really to figure out, well, if we're saying people don't have enough, then what is enough? And it is our task really one big task for us is to figure out what is enough. So what is enough? And that was our kind of big picture question. When converted to research questions, we really wanted to see how much income do people need to meet basic standards of living? How do real incomes in Singapore today fare relative to basic need standards? And then finally, how well do public policy measures fare when evaluated against these what we call MIS baselines? And our approach is really to figure out, how do ordinary people think about basic needs and draw from the wisdom of ordinary people who are reflecting on the social norms of where our baselines are today to do that. So the components of our research are such that, we ask people to talk about and define, what are basic needs. And then we get people to convert those things to actual items. So having defined basic needs as including things like food, clothing, housing, opportunities to education, to healthcare, to work-life balance, as well as the ability to have some choices and to participate and to have respect and belonging. We also then ask people, well, if this is a hypothetical flat, let's walk through the flat. What kinds of things do we need in the living room, in the kitchen, in the bedroom, for going out that would ensure that people can meet those basic needs. And then we went out and we priced the items. And then having priced the spoons and the forks and the sofa and the bed sheets and whatever, we put that together into these household budgets for different kinds of households.
Wow, there's a lot in that. Kok Ho, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah. Is my audio okay?
Yes, it's okay.
Yeah, it's okay, yeah. Right. I briefly left the session earlier, so I don't know when you stopped.
You can talk about the
This
outcomes.
yeah, this most recent report that we published is actually the third in a series, so it doesn't stand on its own. We published the first report in 2019. That one looked at older people, 65 years and older. And then in 2021, we did a follow-up study on working age households. So this latest edition of the study is focused on adjusting the budgets for inflation between 2020 and 22. And then, of course, the study sets out to measure how much it costs for households to have a basic standard of living. But at the back of all our reports, we also compare these income standards with people's actual wages and various public schemes, right? So we know how people in different occupations or educational groups fare. And given the very many public schemes we often hear about, what they actually amount to compared to what households need.
Right. So if I could read the numbers for the 2023 findings, so 3,369 for a single parent with one child, aged 2 to 6 years old, 6,693 for a couple with two children, aged 7 to 12 and 13 to 18, and 1,492 for a single elderly person, 65 years and older. So my next question is, when we discuss these things, right, there's a tendency for us to get very mechanical, and even the responses, the refutations will be pretty mechanical as well. And one of the elements that I find to be missing is the issue of dignity, right? I mean, a lot of people have said it, I think including Gandhi. I believe that poverty really has a potential to strip somebody of their dignity. So what do you think about that? When especially as people who, I mean, you guys have done a lot of ground research. Do you find that that is the case, or am I misreading the situation?
Well, the headlines to do with the studies often focus on the numbers. So those are what comes to people's minds. But when we talk to ordinary people, so these are the research participants, we found that the way they think about basic needs is a very rich one. So people were able to talk about both material as well as non-material needs. So things like respect, independence, and belonging, they kept coming up, and people were very articulate about it. Dignity that you mentioned, they could see the link between dignity and things like choice, right? Being able to choose to take part in social activities. They talked about it as being linked to independence, being able to enjoy respect from those around us, being able to participate in society. Right? So all this are requirements for a dignified life. So that's not to say money is not important, right? Or that the participants didn't think money is not important. Money is the precondition to those things that people value and need. Right? So older people need a budget to buy gifts for grandchildren, to contribute to their religious communities. The young people talk about needing to get out of Singapore from time to time to deal with stress and to see other places. Working women need clothing, accessories, so that she can feel like she belongs and participate in the social life of her workplace. And then youths, they talked about needing things like bubble tea, right? Because it's a social activity that allows them to participate in the things that their peers do. So that is at the heart of the MIS study, right? It looks at people's material and non-material needs and then converts them into an income. So when we see the number, we mustn't forget all the stuff that lies underneath.
Right. So that's interesting. Before I get to Prof. Teo, so you mentioned money is a precondition basically to participate in this social life. And the things you just mentioned, for a lot of Singaporeans, they would say, why is that part of minimum income? You mentioned traveling, bubble tea. Why is that? Isn't that a luxury? How would you respond to that strand of criticism? You're including a lot of things which are not part of an actual person's needs, but rather desires.
These items that eventually appeared on the list, they are anchored by a definition, a textual definition of what basic needs are. And that textual definition itself fleshes out some of this material and non-material components of a basic standard of living. So the things that I just talked about, right? Independence, respect, social participation, were things that ordinary members of public said that in Singapore today must be considered basic needs. So they were quite clear at the outset. This was not controversial, you know, that in Singapore today, subsistence, so physical survival, staying alive, is no longer an adequate baseline given the kind of society that we are. So based on this definition that they constructed, subsequently items were then debated and decided on as a way of achieving this textual definition. So this is a way to say some of those items that on their own, disconnected from this context of the discussions that the participants went through, they will strike us as, you don't need this for physical survival, right? But when we brought participants through a process of thinking about what it means to enjoy a basic standard of living in Singapore today, and then what do you need to achieve that definition, that standard of living, these are the items that they had no problems agreeing on.
Okay, thank you. Prof. Teo?
I would just add that, on certain items, because our participants also emphasize choice, it's important to remember, of course, not every single person will like bubble tea, but the purpose of talking about bubble tea and including something like bubble tea in the budget is to say that young people said that they need a budget so that they can go out with their friends, and do something social, and it's a relatively inexpensive item that allows them to partake in the social life of young people. So of course not all young people, we're not going to say that everybody has to have exactly the same item, but it's important for the budget to include items that will allow people to make some choices and allow people, very importantly, to participate in the social life.
Yeah, I guess that's the reasoning behind that, right? It's not about bubble tea, but it's the human need to partake in social life, right? And there's almost a sense when people criticize you guys, including that, right? There's almost a sense of elitism, right? Oh, for me, I deserve this, right? I need my social life, right? But for you, if you are of a lower income, you don't really need that. That's not part of your. It reminds me of a term you mentioned in your book, Prof. Teo, which is differentiated deservedness, right? Which brings me to the next question. And both of you have written a lot on social policy, on inequality. And it seems to me, however you slice the cake, we always go back to the idea of meritocracy as a root problem. So is meritocracy indeed the root problem? And is there an alternative to meritocracy? Doesn't seem like there would be something that we could use to replace that in order to alleviate inequality or all of these social issues, social problems that you point out.
I mean, meritocracy, I think in Singapore is often used as a shorthand to describe the way we organize society and our social welfare system. So if we think of meritocracy as the ideology that people's achievements or the lack of achievements have individual reasons, right? Have reasons rooted in individual rather than social conditions. That thinking is entirely consistent with, or I should say symptomatic of, our very neoliberal approach to welfare, by which I mean our social policies tend to be very narrowly targeted, very residual, meaning it's thought of, we insist that it's help of the last resort, and the help given even as a last resort is very limited. So within this model, this very individualistic way of organizing society, people are expected to meet their basic needs through market participation or mainly work. Any social assistance that they can fall back on is very narrow, it covers very few people, or very ungenerous, very low amounts for a very short period of time. This essentially, I think, is what a lot of people are thinking about, right, when we say it's a meritocratic society. And of course, there are alternative ways in the real world. There are alternative ways of organizing society and our social welfare based on more solidarity, based on more collective provision rather than individualism and market competition. So in very practical terms, it means pooling resources through taxation, and then distributing it across everyone in society through high quality public services, childcare, healthcare, housing, as well as through income protection in those phases of our life when we expect incomes to fall, like old age, injury and disability, as well as unemployment. So there are real examples, right? There are certainly alternatives to the way we have organized our society so far.
Right.
Yeah,
Prof. Teo?
and
Yeah.
I think when we think about this, we also need to emphasize, that or remind ourselves that everyone lives in society, which is to say, everybody's well-being is linked in very important ways to the social conditions, that we live in. So the education we have access to, the roads or the buses or trains that we use, the healthcare systems that we tap into, etc. And so when we think about any given individual contributing to the collective, it has to be with this view that all of us who contribute and our families will reap the benefits of public goods at various times in the life course. Yeah. And when everybody living in society is able to meet their needs, we all benefit, because it will mean that all the people we are connected to, family, friends, co-workers, neighbors, etc., will have better health, are better cared for and educated, are less stressed and more motivated, and so on. So if there's a baseline below which we would not fall, it would also mean that we would feel more secure. We would know that the various situations that we may face in life, illness, old age, family conflict, that these would not be things that put us in positions of precarity. And I think that, because we live in such a society where the anti-welfare discourse is quite strong, where we are so often hearing things like, well, who's going to pay for it? Or this is a slippery slope, or people will become uncompetitive and lazy. I think we really need to, rethink or really need to keep in mind, that we all benefit from, everyone benefits from sort of these protections being in place, because we all need those services. And given that it's not obvious how social protection can benefit society, leadership really matters. And the work of political leaders should be to galvanize people, to build solidarity among people, to get people to see that they have interest in contributing to the collective resources, and that they benefit from a fairer society where everyone can meet their needs. I think that's really, really important.
So almost as if you preempted my next question. So basically, basically what you're saying is social welfare should be pursued at the very least for individual welfare, right? It's not just an altruistic argument, but everyone will benefit ultimately, right? So, and one of the things that I think we really should do away as a society is the term self-made, because even if you are a rags to riches story, right? I mean, you didn't make the roads yourself. You didn't build the schools. There is no such thing as a self-made individual at all, right? Anywhere in society. Yeah, so I really like that answer. There's a question here from Prof. Yenn Chong. He said, meritocracy in Singapore seems to be a backward justification of economic and social achievement. A question worth asking is, what is merit and who gets to define it? Anyone wants to take a step?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there are in fact, in a lot of my research, this is what I found, that there are in fact a lot of qualities that people have that are not necessarily recognized as qualities or recognized as strengths, right? And that the way merit is defined and merit is rewarded in our society is a pretty narrow way, with very specific milestones and very specific timing. Like if you don't display the right qualities at the right time, there are also not necessarily things that get rewarded. And as a lot of research in Singapore as well as other contexts have shown, a lot of the qualities that are recognized and rewarded also depend a lot on private resources. And this is why, this is why people, parents who have the means, feel so strongly, you know, that in absent of, if this is the game and this is, you know, this kind of competition is important, then, you know, private investments in children becomes a really big part of how to generate so-called merit.
How do we get around that, the private investment in children? Like, I mean, it's given the situation. I mean, every parent would want to do that, right? How do we get around that? Is there any foreseeable solution around it, which would just then worsen the inequality?
I mean, you can get at this from different angles, right? One is to say that, and again, there are real world examples. In Northern Europe, where there isn't, for example, a huge private tuition industry, right? That is because they provide universal, high quality public services, right? So public services that cover everyone of such high quality that they squeeze out the private market. What can a tuition center offer that my public school doesn't? And not just my public school, but all the public schools in our country do that. So what do you leave? There is no gap in the market for the private tuition center. So we often say universal high quality public services is one way to squeeze out the shadow private industries that come in to kind of address people's insecurities and worries. And when I say insecurities and worries, this is something that Yenn has mentioned before, right? Which is, I mean, no parent is happy to be spending so much time and money on tuition. Which parent wants to do that? But they feel they have to because the stakes are very high. The consequences are very serious. They worry that if my child ends up in occupation A, his life will be very different than if he ended up in occupation B. That is to say, wage inequality itself is also related to people's anxieties about education and so on. So educational inequality, sometimes we hear about how schools should tweak some of the admission criteria or send their students out into the community to do community service and so on. All those programs are fine, right? But the root of educational inequality does not really lie in the education system. It's in all of society.
Yeah. So in fact, that what you just said, Kok Ho, right? It can even reward people with more resources, right? Because then their children are able to do all of these extra activities, even though it comes from a good place, right? So there is a question before I move on, because you mentioned welfareist policies or more universalist policies. That's the term you used. There's a question from Ahmad. I don't think you can see it, or I don't know whether you can see it. What is the panel's perspective on policies to restrict the tuition industry? Or sorry, yeah, carry on. Yeah, good.
I mean, I think getting to the root of why the industry exists is important. Yeah. So I think in general that if you want to fix a problem, you need to understand its basis. Yeah. So if you look closely at why parents behave the way they do, it's related to what Kok Ho just said about how they read the outcomes, right? What they think will happen if they don't provide. So in our groups, for example, when we ask parents whether tuition is a basic need, you know, parents were very, very, there was a great deal of angst in this part of the discussion, yeah, where they felt like, yes, they do think it is, because the teachers cannot possibly pay attention to so many kids in the classroom, that if children fall behind, they will feel that this will really affect their confidence, and that then, you know, they will continue to do more poorly. They want their children to be able to be financially independent in the long run, because they also understand that all their needs in the future will need to be met by their participation in employment. Yeah. And so they see that the stakes are very high. And so there's a sense of resignation. You know, we had participants put this really quite well. She said, you know, if Singapore, no meritocracy, no PSLE, no exam, then tuition no need lah. But that's not the world we live.
Okay, thank you. So there are questions here. So I'll address that. I'll ask them in a while. So I want to move on, right? So not that I disagree with the two of you. I wouldn't dare. But let's say I were to channel like a critic, and I would say, oh, you are speaking about this, but ultimately, right, who pays for this? Resources are finite and limited. So who will pay? Wouldn't your suggestions squeeze the middle class even further? You already talked about raising taxes, right? And then, in Singapore, if you were to raise taxes, we are a small economy, then investors will not come in and so on. So is this a practical solution for a small, open economy like Singapore?
When it comes to public services, right, we are already paying for it in some way, right? So it's not a question of to raise taxes or not raise taxes. It's not that if you don't raise taxes, then there is no need to pay, right? We are all always already paying for it. The only question is how. So in so-called cheaper welfare states like ours, right, if the public services are often not fully funded through public finances, it just means that people pay more out of their pockets, right? And then those who want and can afford better may even go private, right? They buy private services at a premium, right? Just think private preschool and so on. And then at the other end, those who cannot even afford subsidized public services, they may opt for cheaper options that do not fully meet their needs. So you can think about informal childcare arrangements, for example. They also pay. They pay for it in terms of sacrificing some aspects of their needs. I mean, care is a great example, right? Because we like to think of it as free, right? Care for family members and so on, just because it takes place in the home, within a family. But actually, when a parent, so usually mothers, right, stop work to care for the children, she is paying, right? She's paying by foregoing her income, and not just in the present, she's paying by foregoing her retirement savings, right? So the point is that someone always pays.
Right.
When we say that we want to limit state support, what we are saying is that we want individual households to pay. And in the case of households who can't afford to pay, we are okay that they sacrifice their needs. We like to talk about family support versus state support. But in reality, where do family resources come from, right? The family can only provide support if they have the resources. And that means decent wages and public services that take up a smaller portion of their work income. Then they can start storing resources. In the end, we can't talk about family support without talking firstly about public provision, and then the other thing, which is wages.
Right.
Yeah. I was saying earlier, about the amount of angst that parents bring to this topic, and I think on the whole, in this research as well as in other research that we're doing, we see a lot of anxiety among people that have to do with insecurity, right? Parents feeling anxious that their children cannot keep up in school and that they have to pay for tuition. Older people anxious about poor health and healthcare costs and worried about burdening their children in the future. Young people who are worried that they cannot afford housing of their own in the future. So because people are extremely aware that they have to take care of themselves on all fronts, this shapes all kinds of behaviors that they take, turning to tuition, keeping a close eye on children's education, buying private insurance,
Right.
taking safer options when it comes to jobs and careers. So these costs to families really go beyond the financial.
Right.
The financial part is very important, but in addition to that, it costs something to family lives.
Right.
Family harmony. It costs something to mental well-being. It costs something to our sense of who we are relative to other members of society, to our sense of solidarity. It costs something to living a full and creative life, So I think the absence of social security has really meant a huge cost to individuals and families, particularly to middle and lower income ones. So to say that the alternative is more costly, I think is really obscuring how costly it is now.
Right. So this study and research of yours is really more than about financial security, right? It's really about emotional, mental, spiritual, community. Everything is related to this, right? Based on the answer you just gave. And I also we are also very selective, right, as a society about asking the question who pays for it. Right? I've never heard somebody ask the question, right? Who pays for our defense, right? Not that I'm saying we should reduce defense spending or what. I'm just saying that I've never heard that question being asked, right? And it's always about priorities. So, but thanks. That was a full answer, I thought. Okay. So it took us 32 minutes, but I have to ask the next question. Yeah, so the next question. What was the government's quibble with your study? And how would your response be? And I think, first of all, I also need to acknowledge that the fact that they responded in that way, I think it shows that your study is worthy of a response. And it's great that they decided to respond that way, right? You know, because there could be other ways like POFMA or whatever it is, but we would always be happy if this is how the government engages with academic work, right? So what exactly was their quibble and how would you respond to it?
Okay. So there were a few different critiques from the Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Social and Family Development and Ministry of Manpower. Yeah, I think. So the critiques were, number one, that these are not needs. These are, I quote, what individuals would like to have. Number two, that because we have higher income participants, that this skewed the findings. Number three, that there were discretionary items such as jewelry, perfume, and holidays. Number four, that lower income families receive more help than we assume. Yeah, let's stick with those four. And also in response to our recommendations, they also had some quibbles.
Yeah. Actually, they were a bit friendlier, more polite this time than they were in 2021. Which is strange because it's the same study, but they're a bit friendlier. So we made 3 explicit recommendations. I think they accepted the principle of it on the first 2 recommendations. We talked about we recommended that a living wage be seriously considered. We haven't really discussed it. We can talk about it later. They support this intent of paying a decent wage, but they argue over the best way to do it. We recommended improving retirement income adequacy, and they also acknowledge that currently in the current system, some people are not able to fully benefit from the CPF system and so on. So on those 2 counts, they do accept the premise of our recommendations. But the third one was I think conveniently ignored. That was the one about policy practices, right? Indexing, so pegging your policy parameters and features to inflation. They did not address that. And then using transparent, rigorous benchmarks when you finally do update your policies. No comment. Yeah, but otherwise, there are some areas of agreement this time.
Okay.
Yeah. So can we answer?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So to answer the critiques, I think we need to return to our methodology to emphasize that it's very important to take seriously how ordinary people view basic needs. So all the things that we've talked about so far this evening are not things we made up on our own. Yeah, the fact that basic needs are complex and that they're layered and they have these elements that are more than about mere survival. All of these things are things that came from participants. Now, the methodology we use includes having a mixed group in terms of socioeconomic background, because we want to make sure that we don't end up either with very high budgets or very low budgets. Okay, so we have to have a mixed group. We also have to facilitate the groups in particular ways so that we can create space for all participants to speak. So in 2021, our focus groups, 15% of our participants lived in private properties, but 18% lived in public rental flats. In practice, this this meant that each focus group had only 1 to 2 persons from either private housing or rental flats within this group of about 8 persons, each focus group of about 8 persons. As for educational profile, 82% of our participants between 25 and 54 years old had post-secondary education, which is comparable to 79% of all Singapore residents in the same age group in 2020. So the educational profile is closely reflective of the general population. Yeah, so there is no, it certainly does not reflect a high education, high income kind of budget. Yeah.
Right.
We also use case studies. So we have this group of people, they are from mixed income education backgrounds, but also we always tell them, okay, you're not just talking about yourself. You're thinking about this case of Madam
Right.
M or Miss K or Chow Z. Yeah. And you need to be, it's not about you, it's about thinking, you know, what could be considered basic for a person in this kind of household. We also, I mean, it's a good question to ask whether people are talking about needs or whether they're talking about wants. And this was something we were also very mindful of in running the focus group discussions. And we really wanted to make sure, yeah, that the budget that we end up with is a budget we can defend to the public. Yeah, that will not be seen like, oh, it's a you know, it's fantasy kind of budget, right? So often when people say, okay, this item is a need, we will ask people, well, what happens to Madam M or Mr. K or Chow Z if they don't have this thing? Yeah, because to say that something is a need is to say that if they don't have this thing, some harm will be done.
Right.
Some serious deprivation exists. Yeah, and they would tell us that if they don't have a mobile phone, how are they supposed to live in Singapore?
Yeah.
They cannot contact anyone. They cannot, you know, read the news. They cannot be on social media. I mean, those are all things that are necessary for participating in society today. So of course they need it. If a child doesn't have a tablet or access to computer in the context of today, they would not be able to study, right? They would not be able to do during the pandemic, they would not be able to do home-based learning. So of course, it's a big deprivation if that thing is not on the list. If children don't have a budget or older people don't have a budget to buy a birthday gift so that they can attend, you know, another child's party, they would be left out. Yeah. They would be left out in important ways. Again, they cannot participate in important ways. So we push people in that way to tell us, you know, what is the rationale for saying this is a thing that is a need. And often participants would challenge one another, you know, because we do these focus group discussions for so many hours. At some point, someone will be like, are you sure that is a need, not a want? You know, they will also start to challenge one another.
Right.
And anything that ends up on the budget has to be there after consensus is made. It implies that there will be things that they will say, no, we cannot agree. This cannot be considered basic in Singapore today. So air conditioning is a good example of that, where they actually deliberated quite a bit. And, you know, people talked about increasing temperatures. They talked about the haze from a couple of years ago. But then they ended up saying, no, we cannot say that this is a basic need. Yeah, there were certain things like cars, for example, that were not even on the table. Nobody even raised it because nobody thinks that in the Singapore context that could be considered a basic need.
Thank you. So, yeah. Did you want to say anything more? Or?
Go.
There is I hesitate over this because this is technical and a little bit dry. But one of the criticisms is that we don't account for the assistance given to lower income families.
So I'll just.
Shall I continue? I can continue.
Yeah, please.
On his behalf.
Yeah.
So I think Ho was saying about the critique that we don't take into account government assistance. So maybe it's worthwhile explaining a little bit how we did take into account of government assistance in our report. So where there are subsidies for public services that are universal, meaning everybody receives the same amount, and where it's automatic, meaning we don't need to apply, these are deducted from the item prices during the budget calculations. So polyclinic fees, for example, where there are some automatic subsidies, we build it into our pricing. Where subsidies are income tested, meaning whether or how much support there is depends on the individual or the household income, then we assume median income so that the budgets are applicable to most of society. Koho, do you want to talk about housing?
Yeah, housing is one particular one, right? So where there are subsidies that are not universal, which means they are means tested, we need to assume a certain amount of income in order to do the calculations, right? So one of the quibbles is that we assume median income. So this is the income level right smack in the middle of the distribution. To us, that's perfectly reasonable so that the amount of housing subsidies reflects what the typical household in society receives, right? So the criticism that actually the lowest income households receive a lot more, but to assume maximum rates of subsidies, which in fact only received by a very small number of very low income households, I mean, that would underestimate the household budgets and create a very misleading picture of living costs.
Do you have a number on how many people, what's the percentage of people that receive the highest number of subsidies?
It's a whole range, and then we use the calculator that's on HDB's website to calculate. So it's not categories; it's a scale.
Right. Okay. Okay. Good. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So sorry, I keep dropping off.
No.
I think someone doesn't want me to speak.
Yeah. You're being censored, and not by me, by the way. No. So this idea, it comes up over and over again. I think you guys are challenging the country and the government and Singaporeans to rethink what it means to have minimum income, right? Because you are including the human element far more into this, right? I mean, in your answers, you think about the social life, which anyone who has elderly parents will know that whatever you just said is true, right? As in, it's for a human being to survive in old age, you need far more than the basic needs. Because the way we think about it is just food on the table, that's it, right? But I think, Prof. Teo, you mentioned in your book, this is what inequality looks like. One of the criticisms Singaporeans always mention about people who live in social housing is that, oh, you're so poor, and yet you still have a TV, right? But actually, a TV is much more of a necessity for people there than people in higher income households, because if they have to go to work, and that's how they take care of their children and so on. So I think it requires sort of a mindset shift in thinking about income. And I mean, I definitely also, there were some things that I sort of assumed that these were not needs. And after reading your report, I was thinking, oh, actually, that's the wrong way of looking at it. There's a question here, and this is a bit methodological by Nessa. Were there any striking differences in the response from participants across different social classes? If so, how did you aggregate these variations?
Shall I go? It's not aggregation, right? I know we are tempted to talk about an average, right, or an aggregate. We don't really. The way to think about it, the logic behind it is not a mathematical one at all. In a way, the process itself is a very social one, right? So it's not about adding things up or about adding up and then dividing. And there was one particular session where one very enthusiastic participants, as sometimes appear in focus groups, said that because they couldn't agree on something, and then someone said, why don't we take a vote? And then I had to stop them and say, hey, no, we don't do voting. But he said, that's the fastest one. Let's just take a vote. And I had to put my foot down and say, no voting, right? If we were to do voting, let's just do a survey. There's no need to do a focus group, right? So I say the process is a social one because everyone has to listen to other participants, which if you take part in a survey, you don't. You listen to other people, you process it. If you disagree, you must say so. You must explain your own views so that other people hear from you. And through that process, you must come to an agreement. So this process itself is a social one. I mean, we don't talk about it a lot, but we enjoy it very much ourselves. And so do the participants. There were some sessions where after one of these focus groups, we tidy up, right? We keep the flip charts, our stationery, and so on. And when we leave the venue, there was one group of participants that was still at the lift landing chatting, right? Because they wanted to continue talking to each other about it. There is something in the process of research like this, right? There's participatory, there's consensual, where you need to listen as well as speak and try to understand each other. That is how we arrive at these budgets, right? So not so much aggregating, but negotiating, understanding, and agreeing.
So this, what you just said, Ko, right? This is quite un-Singaporean, right? Like your this data gathering process is a social one, right? You are requiring Singaporeans to have a paradigm shift of sorts, right? Thinking about data in a different way. This is heavy lifting, isn't it?
I'll say you go, yeah.
Before we embarked on this research, and well, you will know this well as well, that before research actually gets done, there's so much time spent just conceptualizing it, right? And when you are working in a team as we did, we spent a lot of time worrying whether it will work in the Singapore context, because this methodology is a methodology that we learned from a UK team that has been doing it for many years. They are at the University of Loughborough Centre for Research on Social Policy. And we had read their reports, we had read their work, we had talked to them. We spent hours and hours sort of like figuring out, how to adapt the methodology to the Singapore context. And one of the things that we were worried about was, well, if we put people in a room together, will they be able to come to consensus? Will they be willing to do this exercise as we ask them to do it, where they have to kind of think about what is basic for everybody in society. They have to discuss these issues that sometimes can get very abstract. Can ordinary people do it? And the answer is yes. And that we were not completely sure when we started, but what we found in the process is that yes, if you set up the space for it, meaning if you give people the tools for it, the time for it, if you walk people through, how to do it, people are extremely capable. And there's something about the exercise, actually it did not take that long to explain to people what it is we were trying to get them to do, what the tasks were. There was something actually fairly intuitive about it. And all the things we've said about basic needs, about belonging and respect and dignity, these are things ordinary people say.
Right.
Yeah, it's I think if we how shall I say, if we take more seriously what ordinary people can do and are capable of doing, and how ordinary people feel and take seriously their experiences of society, we can learn a great deal about Singapore.
Trust the average Singaporean more than we usually do, right? So there are a couple of questions here. One is, was there anything included in the MIS budget that surprised either of you? That you didn't anticipate at the start that this would be?
I must say, just
travel.
like Yenn, travel for you.
Go ahead.
I mean, like Yenn mentioned, we read the findings from the UK study, and then we think, but they're different society. Would Singaporeans say this? And the items that become controversial are so different in every society. We thought holiday might be controversial. Nothing.
Right.
We thought tuition might be controversial. Nothing. People just, by nothing I mean that people just passed it. They agreed,
right.
Like with a collective shrug. They were just focused on telling us the rationale, right? So after a few of these surprises, I don't think I had in my mind items that I did not have a list that I thought would or would not appear in their that they will agree on in the end. I don't know, Yenn, you were saying holidays, maybe.
I was gonna say, that the thing on the discussion on holiday was fairly interesting to me. That because it's not entirely intuitive that a holiday would be part of a basket that's called basic
Right.
needs, right? And so I did not expect participants to quite so easily see why it would be. And they talked about how, because our first research was older people, right? They talked a lot about how, well, life is very stressful in Singapore, and they think about the young people. They when they talk about it, actually they often refer to younger people, even though we were asking them to talk about older people's needs. They talk about how in Singapore society today, since so many people are traveling all the time and work is so stressful, if it's not on the list, that implies nobody can ever go on a holiday, and they simply could not accept that to be the case. And they often said, especially young people, they have to go out and occasionally, de-stress and occasionally see other parts of the world so that they can be on pace with others, and so it's there were certainly things that I thought we would have I thought the Singapore report would end up being, I guess what is the word I'm looking for? Sort of more austere than the UK budget, but it was actually quite comparable
Right.
in terms of the qualitative stuff
Are
that
you
people say are
saying
important.
that Singapore is not unique? Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think that is something for us to take. We always like to overemphasize our uniqueness, right? But yeah, ultimately we are not different from many other societies, I suppose. So, Farain, what are the essential mindset shifts that we need to consider for a more equitable Singapore? And whose mindsets?
I was going to ask
Yeah.
you that question. I mean, if you ask me, I of course think that it's policy mindsets that needs to shift. We often say we are a pragmatic society. Then let's be open-minded about what works, what has worked, as well as what hasn't worked. Right? Let's look at the options. Let's study them systematically. Let's look at the results. Let's share the results with the public, and then let's make our collective minds up about what is a good approach and what isn't. And I said this is an ideological issue, right? It's
Indeed.
almost like there's an ideological mental block when it comes to thinking about policy. There are some corners that people just cannot turn, right? So until they decide to turn, then suddenly they find there are no ghosts, right, around the bend. And the clearest example is the progressive wage model. I mean, for many years, researchers and others who are concerned about low wages, advocating that low wage, the stagnation of wages at the bottom of the distribution were a problem. And historically, there's this policy mindset where we are very hesitant about wage interventions. The argument is that even low wage workers' situations are improving, and that all wages must always be tied to productivity. And if you increase wages, consumers will not be willing to pay. Those was always the defense, right? But in 2021, right, when the mood flipped, right, suddenly you hear policymakers repeating what to me, right, are critics' arguments. And then suddenly we are told that actually the gap between low and median wages are not improving enough, that productivity is not enough to lift wages. And then suddenly we are told there's been a survey that shows that consumers are willing to pay, right? We hear these arguments and repeated back to us. So there are instances, right, that if ideology, that ideological mental blocks, right, can just be let go of, then we can make pragmatic decisions that actually work.
I think thank you for saying that. I think we like to assume that in Singapore our policies are never ideological, right? When it's hardly ever true. There are deep ideologies behind many, and not that it's wrong. I think being ideological doesn't mean being not pragmatic, but the refusal to admit that there is an ideological bent or decision making behind it, as if it's just of pure cost and benefits. Even what you view as a cost or benefit is dependent on your ideological predisposition to begin with, right? So there's a question by Jonathan. Should there be a greater weightage given to the lower socioeconomic status compared to the higher socioeconomic status, considering that the high SES will be less affected? I'm assuming, Jonathan, you're talking about the focus group discussion participants in your study in the MIS. Was there weightage given to the higher weightage given to the lower SES, or?
No, the methodology is, most focus group discussions are about drawing in representatives of different groups and then using that as a quick way to gather the data of those as representations of those groups. Our focus group discussions are really about getting people together to achieve consensus on what they think is a basic standard of living for everybody in society. So it is meant to be something that we can say should be basic needs for everybody in society. So it's not a budget only for low income persons or middle income persons or high income persons.
Okay, right. Thank you.
It's a baseline below which no one should fall.
Right. Okay. And the living wage is $2,990 on average, right? That's the living wage. So gross monthly would be 2,556, and this is the target that no one should fall below, right? So my final set of questions, I don't say my final question, final series of questions, right? So what is next in your step what is the next stage of research? And you mentioned just now, Kok Ho, that the government is friendlier. Their reaction to your report is friendlier this time, and I guess that's a positive sign. What is next, and what is it that you would like to see happen in the short to medium term?
Because we've now done this for quite a number of years, right? We started thinking about it actually in 2016, and then now we are 3 reports on. We've done a few launches. We've seen how the government responds, also how the media respond and how the public respond, and we see movement. I mean, there's been a lot of movement in the discourse. And in case you haven't already seen it, a friend just sent me a link that apparently they debated this in Parliament today.
Yeah.
But as ST says that Parliament debates NTU study on income adequacy. So sorry, you take the hit this time. Yeah, we take turns, how we take turns. So I hope it keeps moving. But when I say moving, it means that people's discussion is advancing, right? We no longer need to revisit some of the old territory. We hope we continue to see that. I know that there are journalists who are very interested to write about these stories, and of course they operate under challenges and difficult conditions themselves. But I hope as a society, when the public talk about it, when the media report it, when the government engage with us over these findings, we can keep trying to think about it properly. I said at our report launch, I hope by now, after we have done this, we have rehearsed this process of releasing results, and then they see that people can digest it and think about it and make sense of it without a huge public backlash. I hope the message that we all take away from it is that we can think and talk about these findings, and that there is no need to panic. That for me is I hope to see this change of mood continuing to happen.
Right. Prof?
I think we would also like to continue to engage in various ways with the public more generally, to kind of open up the conversation about what it means to flourish in today's Singapore, what it means, what development and economic growth was for, and who should, and how should we think about ensuring that everybody, is able to, in this very wealthy country, attain basic standards of living. I hope that more of the vocabulary around dignity and living wages will spread, that more people will think about these concepts and I suppose think about how to apply it in different ways in the areas that they are concerned about and in the areas that they're working in. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, when doing this MIS research really deepened our appreciation for people's capacity, for people's capacity to come together, to discuss serious things, work through disagreements, arrive at some consensus, and we feel that that's a really valuable thing that I hope also other researchers will do, and so that the research environment that we're in will also grow. We hope to be part of that growth, and that development of taking seriously ordinary people's views and experiences of the world. So I guess in terms of in practical terms, in terms of the work that we do, we'll continue to do more podcasts and interviews and commentaries, and now we're first time IG Live. And we hope that in all these ways, I mean, this is not exactly our natural environment, so yeah, hopefully people will forgive us our
I'm sure
clumsiness
they
and all
will.
that. And it's great if some of this message can continue to spread, and we feel. We always feel very encouraged actually after each report, because we hear from lots of members of the public. We hear a lot of encouraging messages from colleagues and friends and students. And I think that there is something about this work that resonates with people.
Right. So I have the
sorry. Actually, I should
Go on.
also say that of course beyond that, we hope for actual policy changes as well around wages, around schemes, especially for older persons and lower income persons, and also that there are clear criteria, regular checks and clear criteria for looking at whether schemes are working or not working.
Okay, thank you. I have the Straits Times article. I mean the online article, the in front of me that co-reference. Parliament debates on what constitutes basic needs after NTU report on adequate minimum incomes. Seems like a misleading headline, but basically it was a PAP MP that asked the MSF whether MSF would consider adjusting financial assistance or at least do its own study to determine the level of living wage. And I think that's great, right? The fact that your research is being debated in Parliament, and I think it's the envy of other academics like myself, I think. And it's very interesting in both your responses. The first thing you talked about was discourse changes, and then you go on to policy. I think a lot of Singaporeans underestimate the power of discourse when we are talking about. They always ask, "Oh, what does talking achieve?" Right? I want to see this, but this is the necessary step before all of that, right? Changing mindsets, putting pressure, because Frederick Douglass said, "Power has never considered itself without demand," right? Never have and never will, right? So I think it's really useful to have this environment of discourse and challenging and debating and negotiating and arguing. Are there any final words from the two of you?
Yenn, shall we?
Go.
That's that thing that we were thinking about saying. I think can say lah, which is that we in a research report of the kind that we write, we try to keep the length fairly short. I know most people don't think it's short, it's a 60 pages, but we try to, it's not a lot of space to talk about a study that is so interesting and rich. It's only in occasions like this, so thanks to Walid for giving us the space to do this, that we can talk about, it's not aggregation, it's negotiation and things like that. But in our report, we have no space to say that. Okay. So it's been on our minds for a while that we should probably, now also 6-7 years into this study, sit back and reflect and think about some of what this study has brought out. about our society, about policies, right, about all of us, right, and what we think is what we think about human flourishing in Singapore, to reflect on some of those lessons, and to put it into a book, right? Because there will never be a report that has space for this.
Wow.
And so
So this is a soft
we
launch, is
will.
it? Soft launch of the book.
This is a soft
haven't delivered
pre.
yet. And
Yeah, cannot soft launch a product that doesn't exist yet. But we want to, we
doesn't
very
fully
much want to
exist.
do.
Exists in parts.
It does. So we want to do a book where we can talk about some of the bigger and really more important and enduring issues behind those figures that change every 2 years, right? We
Right.
keep chasing these figures, but there are lessons, I think, that are more enduring than that, and we want to put those things together.
Prof. Theo, final word?
Oh, in the meantime, you can read all our writings and listen to various podcasts, and even watch a little cartoon video that we produced, that we commissioned in 2019 on our website, whatsenough.sg.
Okay. Thank you so much. I want
Yeah,
sorry.
thank you so
go
much,
ahead.
Walid, for
No.
this opportunity.
No, I
Thanks,
really
Walid.
wanted to thank you for three things. One is for coming on this show. I really appreciate it. For creating Instagram accounts just for this. Second of all, really for the work that you do. I think it's such important work, and I think I personally have witnessed the public discourse, public mood change over the years, and it shows us how valuable academic work can be, because academic work often is detached from society, and I think you guys have shown sort of a blueprint how to make it relatable. And finally, what I would like to thank you for is to make the announcement about your book on this show, so that's an exclusive. Thank you so much. So I look forward to having a second episode with the two of you when the book comes out. All right. Okay. Thank
Thanks so
you.
much, Walid. Thank you, everyone.
Good night,
for tuning
everyone.
in.
Thank
Bye
you.
bye.
Good night.